Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reimagined, a Hidden Compass YouTube series. I am super excited to be joined today by dear friend, former roommate, and data scientist Julie Fortin. Julie is a land use and mountain change researcher, a figure skater, and is currently based at the University of British Columbia. She has a master's in environmental studies where she was part of the Mountain Legacy Project, which we'll talk a little bit more about today. Welcome, Julie. So stoked to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, Lauren. Excited to talk to you again.
My pleasure. Julie and I go way back to my master's, which doesn't seem like a long time ago, but it was a really long time ago. Just frightening.
It was 6 years ago. Yep.
Yeah. We navigated a lot of stuff together as roommates, externally imposed adventures. Well, we're thrilled to have you. I would love to start before we get into Mountain Legacy Project, just chatting about what you're doing now as a data scientist, what that looks like for you. Some listeners might not be familiar with that broad term.
For sure. Data science is a super broad term, and I don't even know if I know how to define it myself. But most of what I do, I work in a research lab at UBC that's called the Land Use and Global Environment Lab. And so we study basically the environmental impacts of agriculture and also the impacts of climate change on agriculture. So kind of goes both ways. And then in my role as a data scientist, I am helping various people in the lab, PhD students, master students, postdocs, research associates with different projects. And so I help collect, curate, clean, and analyze data. And then I sort of help with other lab management tasks. But most of what I'm doing is sort of, getting data prepared for people's analyses for their research.
Can you speak a little bit to what skill sets go into being a data scientist?
I didn't do computer science or anything like that as an undergrad or as my master's. I did my undergrad in earth system science, and then I did my master's in environmental science. And so I was very coming at this with a lot of domain knowledge, but not necessarily a lot of the hard skills knowledge that I expected would be necessary for this kind of work. So there was definitely a little bit of imposter syndrome at the beginning. I was like, why didn't he hire a computer scientist? I don't understand why he hired me. But I think that what's important in a data science role is domain knowledge is actually super important because it gives you the context to know what data should look like. If anything is looks off, what kind of things you can do, what kind of questions you can answer, what kind of methods you should be using to answer your questions. So I think that is important. But obviously the hard skills are also important. So throughout my undergrad and master's, I worked in R, which academics know a lot, and pretty much nobody outside academia uses R, but I get teased a lot by my friends in industry because they say that Python is superior. There's pros and cons to both. So I got some hard skills in programming and version control and stuff like that, and pair that with what I know about the Earth, and that's what I try to do in my job.
Amazing. Super cool. Very succinct. Great answer. And fun to think about, intimidating to think about the scale at which you're considering data, which is something that, ecologists often think about scale, scientists often think about scale, from the micro scale to really small systems we study to global ones. And global data systems are incredible, but also need a number of skill sets and a lot of lateral understanding to deal with something like that. So very impressive.
100%.
One sort of overarching theme of the Hidden Compass YouTube series is new ways of storytelling or new ways of research. In particular, how do we, as people, as scientists, as storytellers, innovate or escape comfort zones, pre-existing comfort zones, to better understand and talk about the world? And so I think Mountain Legacy Project, which you were involved in on your master's, is a really cool example of innovation and action when it comes to understanding systems at these broad scale. So can you tell us a little bit about the Mountain Legacy Project? And then we'll get into sort of like your experience in that project.
Absolutely. Okay, so the Mountain Legacy Project, where do I start? It involves, okay, no, I'm going to rewind about 150 years. When there were settlers who were trying to make the first topographic maps of Western Canada, this was a pretty like colonial exercise because they were trying to map out the land and basically to stake claim on it. But when they were doing this process, they had cameras and they would use a method called phototopography. So they would take pictures, they would climb up to a mountaintop, take pictures of mountains across the valley, and then they would triangulate each peak from at least 2 points. And then they would get back to their office and they would like use these photos to create topographic maps. And throughout this exercise, there were over 120,000 photographs that were taken of the Rockies or of all the mountains in the Canadian Western provinces between, I think, about 1861 is the earliest that we have to about 1960. And yeah, so Eric Higgs is the current principal investigator on the project. He sort of came up with this project many, many years ago when he was working with Janine Rumtula, who is now a professor in forestry at the University of British Columbia. And they found some of these photos, I believe it was in Jasper National Park, and thought, this is so cool. What if we went back to the exact same mountaintop and took the pictures again to see how much has changed? And so that's what Janine did with Eric as well. And they sort of came up with this idea. They did some quantitative analysis of what kind of forest changes they could observe in the photographs. And that's sort of how the Mountain Legacy Project was born. Yeah, so Eric and Janine sort of realized the scope of the scope of the photographic collections. There's 120,000 photos that are preserved in archives in BC and Alberta and federally. And they realized how much potential there was to do projects on landscape change in the mountains of Western Canada. And so I think it's been going for more than 20 years now. And yeah, there's all sorts of different questions that can be answered with this data set, but the process itself of going to find the exact location where these photos were taken and repeating the photos and lining them up as perfectly as you can, that has been a really extraordinary process for me, and I think for everyone who does it. And so it's a lot of fun.
Such a cool project on the individual and like landscape scale. I mean, the act of looking back in history at where this person stood 100 plus years ago and trying to replicate it perfectly based on photographs is incredible as an individual for an experience, but then also the scale of change is really, really fascinating. And for folks listening, we'll hyperlink the websites of, Eric and Janine and Mountain Legacy Project all in the show notes so you can learn more. So can you tell us a little bit more? You started getting into this, what this research like practically looked like for you on the day-to-day while you were involved in it?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of our support while I was there came from Alberta Wildfires Division of Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. And so the field season, we would get a rental car, get all our gear, which is like a lot of gear, a lot of fancy cameras, and a lot of hiking stuff. And we would get to Alberta, and once in Alberta, we would stay at wildfire bases. So this is the bases where wildfire fighters stay, where wildland firefighters stay throughout the summer. And so thanks to their in-kind support, we would stay there, we would be fed and housed, and then we had sort of two options to be getting to the mountains. So on days where there's no wildfires kind of active or on the radar, we would sometimes get helicopter support. And so we would get a helicopter to lift us from base to different mountaintops, sometimes 3-4 mountaintops in a day. And then on days when that was not available, then we would hike up. And the process on the mountain is, maybe I should actually rewind and say, before going to the mountains in the first place, there is someone who has intimate knowledge. His name is Rob Watt. He was a, do you know what his job title was? I should double check. Are you there? Oh, yes, sure. So Rob Watt, I believe he was a conservation officer, but I can double check. Rob Watt knows these mountains super intimately. And so what he would do before we even started the field season is he would take the photographs, the historical photographs, and sort of pinpoint where he thought they were taken from. And so he would use Google Earth and sort of like go down to street level on the mountain and sort of like look around. That's, I believe that this photograph was taken from this peak. Field, we know, okay, we have to retake these 10 photos. They were all taken from this peak. And so that's how we know we either need the helicopter to drop us off on this peak or we need to hike to it. Then the process, once we're on the peak, graphs, and we just sort of walk around until we see like, okay, this mountain is lined with the one in the back, and sort of we would move left, right, forward, backward, up, down. It's very much a trial and error thing until we feel like we've hit the exact correct spot where the photos were taken from. Taken, like the surveyor would just like plop down in one spot and just like sort of rotate. It's kind of easy to get a whole bunch. But yeah, so that was sort of the process, getting to the mountain. On the mountain, you're taking these photos. We're also taking field notes, weather readings, stuff like that. So if anyone wants to back for a third visit, showing the exact location where we took the photo. That's sort of the process. Do that 4 times in a day, come back, do all of our image processing or gear cleaning kind of stuff, and starting on the next day.
So cool. It was a little glitchy as you were talking about it, but I think we caught a vast majority of it. And especially thinking about, triangulating these points built on local knowledge of an expert, and also the quantitative estimates you can pull from photos like this is so cool. It's such a cool use of so many tools like personal knowledge, global mapping, old photos taken by people who didn't have helicopters, in this colonial pursuit to map areas, but that is now an incredibly useful tool, and that were preserved over such a great length of time. So what have you learned? Like, you can speak to this individually or to themes the project has established in this repeat photography. What has changed about these landscapes?
That's a great question. I think some of my favorite images to look at from the Mountain Legacy Project are glacier retreat ones. I think those are the most striking. And I think those are ones that visually are powerful and that the Mountain Legacy Project does really well, because we're taking photos of mountains that had 100 years ago and that don't anymore. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of those that I think are really striking to look at, sort of sad at the same time, but very powerful use of these tools. What I learned mostly throughout my research is about wildfire, actually, funnily enough. So one thing that you notice if you look at all the modern photos that I took in my study area for my master's, which was the Wilmore Wilderness Park, park just north of Jasper, and it's a really phenomenal place. You can only access it on foot or on horseback, helicopter if you have a research license, whatsoever in this park. So and the thing that you notice in it, or that other people from the Mountain Legacy Project have taken, more contiguous forest now than there was 50, 100 years ago. And the main reason for that is that in the past, when Indigenous people lived in these areas or were allowed to be managing the land in these areas, they would use fire at sort of different intensities, different seasons, and they were used intentionally to manage the landscape, which would create these pockets of heterogeneity across the landscape, young forests, old stands, sort of all mixed together. Then when and said, oh no, we can't have any forest fires, we actively started doing fire suppression when there were fires, and then fire exclusion, we just didn't use to begin with. Sort of decreased all of that forest diversity. Age stands sort of started growing, and everything is sort of very uniform now. A whole lot more forest now, and then that has been fire danger because when it does spark, fire can rip through entire like valleys super fast because there's a whole bunch of fuel. It's all the same age, and so it's a much bigger problem than it would have been if there had been some like natural fire breaks throughout the landscape. So I think that's the most masters, and it really shows how impactful land management can be.
I love that. Both of the answers you provided, one, I think when we think about mountains, we think about them as physical, ecological, totally unrelated to the social. And it's so critical to bring in the reality that even, especially in colonial mindset, where we perceive places were untouched or pristine wilderness, that didn't exist. And they were in fact being actively stewarded and managed by nations that still live in these places, and through colonization have lost but are regaining the rights to manage these landscapes through their own assertions. And mountains are so easy to forget, like these vast landscapes, we forget that they were actively managed, and that there are ways besides the ways we're managing them now that could result in better outcomes for forests and people, and so many aspects of social ecological systems. And then the other piece that is I love about Mountain Legacy Project, so much of the reason I wanted to share this with Reimagined, is that climate change is so hard to do science communication about in compelling ways. The scale of change is so massive that it doesn't match with our individual perception of the world very well, both because we live short lives compared to the geological timescale of climate change, but also because climate change looks different on different landscapes on the micro and macro scale. So I remember being so struck by the first photos I saw from the Mountain Legacy Project of Glacier Retreat, where, and again, folks can check this out on their website, it's photography that tells the story of climate change in a really compelling way. And because it's repeat photography, while lots of storytelling happens around climate change, of natural disasters and the consequences of heat wave and all of the other aspects of rapidly changing climate, Mountain Legacy is based in the deep past, and it's such a cool picture of change, a scary one sometimes, but a very compelling one. So yeah, it's such cool research, and I'm so glad you could join today to talk about it, and also talk about the storytelling about it, the compelling aspects of humans on landscapes, whether they be observing via taking photos or managing via fire management or fire suppression. Yeah, it's awesome stuff.
Yeah, I'll also add though that it's something that fire management that settlers sort of came in and started doing many decades ago was not great for a very long time, but there definitely are people in Western science who are up and realizing, okay, wait, like traditional knowledge had it right.
Totally.
We need sort of diversity on this landscape. And obviously late to the party, but getting there. And I think that fire management is seriously improving in a lot of places, and not just Alberta, but BC and Western US as well. Realizing that we need to have prescribed forest thinning, and we need to have certain like fire management things so that we can reintroduce diversity in the landscape.
Absolutely. And there's a really cool body of research around that. I'll link a few articles come to mind that also similarly has this compelling storytelling aspect, because especially in places where people were well trained, by Smokey the Bear to not have any fires, no wildfires in fire suppression campaigns, there's a re-education that has to happen as we discuss the benefits of fire on landscapes, when many of us grew up hearing that like fire is only destructive and not generative. So yeah, great point.
Mhm.
This has been really, really, really wonderful, Julie. It's so good to reconnect. Anything else you want to add? Do you want to like add insight into your hopes for the future of land management here at the end, or share any social media handles, anything like that?
I think that you've pretty much said it all. If you're going to show or add a link to the mountain lake, I think that that's golden. People can go and explore the photographs and there for themselves. We have this really cool like slider tool where you can overlay
Mhm.
them so you see them perfectly aligned and you just slide back and forth to see 100 years ago versus now. Yeah,
So cool.
explore, get out of the mountains, and yeah, just try to document what's going on out there.
I love it. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Julie. I really appreciate your time and your work, and it's very awesome. So keep at it.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Great to talk to you again.